Nitai Go Premanandi. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Welcome to all of you. Now, I have to tell you something funny. I once was asked to give Bhagavatam class in Alachua. And the topic was a similar topic about sex and women and, you know, one of those classes about how bad women are and bad household life is and how this and that, right? So I asked my friend, I said, well, what should I do about this class? He said, call in sick. Because it was such a hard class to give. And then I started giving the class. Then one devotee said, you know, he saw where the class was going, what the verse was about, where the class was going. And he said, oh, this is going to be a popular class because it's a hot topic. You're talking about sex, it's a hot topic. Everyone's going to want to listen. So wait till these recordings get out in the world of ISKCON. This could be the most listened to recordings ever. Huh? Hare Krishna. Okay, so welcome to all of you. We are reading from the article we were reading last week. And this is an article which is, I believe, an interview by a devotee named Matsyavatara, who's an Italian devotee. And you probably figured out if he's an Italian devotee, he's from Italy, right? Yeah. So, I appreciate so much his article that we're going to continue reading from where we left off. Perhaps, and for those of you who weren't here last week, we started discussing the topic of illicit sex by defining what it is. It's an important consideration. And just to review, we discussed broader and more narrow definitions. And the narrow definition being anything outside of 50 rounds to a spouse you're married with, only to have children, is illicit sex. Broader definition is sex within marriage, but not overindulgence, but somehow we're trying to control oneself, but one can't always do that. But trying to become pure and not rationalizing the goal. And that anything beyond that, contraception or sex, which is unrestricted or outside of marriage, is illicit. And then there was a discussion, well, what, somewhere in the Shastra it said if you just think about it or talk about it or plan it, it's illicit. And you could say in a sense it is, but you're not held responsible for that, and it's not the vow you're taking because you can't control that. You can only control whether you do it or not. To some degree you can control it, but the real control happens because of your advancement in devotional service. So then the question came up, well, what if one spouse can follow when one can't? How do we deal with that? So that's where we left off. And then there was a discussion, one of the points was made that the sanctity of the marriage, in other words, keeping the marriage together, is very important. So if one of the spouses has to compromise to keep the other spouse satisfied in a way that the marriage stays together and in a way that gradually that person becomes detached from sex, then the spouse should do that as a duty because their service is to help the other person. And there was a discussion about, well, just the fact that one spouse would want to do that and dealing with that. And we're reading Matsyavatara was talking about sublimation versus repression, and sublimation meaning purification of the desire, and repression meaning pushing the desire down without purifying it or going into denial about it, and or just in some way not properly dealing with it. And then he cited examples of men who were brahmacharis or sannyasis who later in life couldn't control themselves, and kind of like the way I look at it is like a rubber band, and you keep pulling, 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 and then you let it go, and it just a little bit like that, repressing, repressing, and then exploding. So, and he talked about a kind of neurosis coming from repression. So, I'm trying to find the exact place we left off. Anyway, I'll begin reading, and if we've already read this, there's no harm in reading it again. A couple means two people who promise to help each other for the rest of their lives. If one is in need and the other doesn't help, I don't know how this refusal could be beneficial for his spiritual advancement, and how it could be done in the name of devotion to Krishna. So he's saying, you have to analyze if it's going to help the partner. And if it's going to help them overcome that desire, then that service should be done. There can be embarrassment, a little enthusiasm, or whatever else, but something has to be done to help. I've seen so many cases of conflict, and I've come to the deep conviction that there must be a mediation, there must be reciprocal affection, reciprocal care. In other words, one of the spouses has this need and the other one has to deal with it. I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but in my work with people in this situation, I always try to help one of them deal with their sexual desire, because it's my experience and conviction that if a person gets support, they can do much better. And we do have support in ISKCON, but it's not focused. It's general. It's there in the books, it's there in the philosophy. But it's not community support where you have a group you can go to, where you have a book of steps you can take, like that. So if there's more of that, that would help a person. And, letting the person express himself, why he's feeling this way, letting himself look at how he ended up in the situation. Because a lot of people end up in a situation later in life that they weren't in earlier in life, or they're finding themselves desiring this way. So, when the desire for intercourse assumes a dangerous psychological proportion, producing a fixed idea, a true neurosis, we should act as with any other disease, looking for a remedy and a cure. So he's saying, now, if it's getting out of hand or uncontrollable, we have to deal with it. Fixed idea means a person can't see anything outside of that idea. When I acted as a direct witness and I advised people in this way, they often solved the problem brilliantly, gradually finding balance, detachment, and serenity, discovering a type of affection that was not based on sexual intercourse. So in other words, he's saying that he helps people who are dealing with a desire that's abnormal. And he sees that as a disease. And he helped them so that their affection for their spouse wasn't such a physical expression, where it was more balanced and detached. And they discovered a more a kind of affection that wasn't based on sexual intercourse. So it's like a conditioning that generally men go through, where their affection just becomes all physical, and any physical contact they have with a woman becomes sexual. Real affection, spiritual affection, has no need for sexual intercourse or physical contact. Such affection is the achievement of the target of bhakti and is obtained after a long practice. It's not a starting point. At the beginning, a couple might endeavor to overcome the problem, but to rise above it, the effort must be equipped with enough capacity and experience, and above all, cultural and spiritual maturity in Krishna consciousness. Cultural conditioning, I spoke about religious duties, but now I wish to mention the cultural environment where every one of us, consciously or unconsciously, lives. Over the last century, Western culture has been increasingly fascinated by rationalism and materialism, progressively polluting itself with a pseudo-scientific literature that has considerably contributed to the development of a dangerously permissive sexual behavior. Such literature has induced people to think of eroticism and sexual acts as something physiologically necessary, comparing sex desire to the need for food and air. Not only so what he's doing is he began by saying that sometimes a person's sexual desire becomes a disease, it's abnormal, and he has to help them balance and become normal and teach people how, particularly men, how they can have physical affection without sexual affection. And then he went on to say that when you're Krishna conscious, ultimately you'll transcend that, or at some point in your life you won't need it. But as younger married couples, that's not where they start, so they'll need it, and they need to learn how to express physical affection, which is free of sexual desire, which all the men are listening to that is going, how do you do that? You take pills that numb you. That's how you do it. No. That's the way men are so wired. They're like, how do you do that? I don't know what that is. So then the man's saying, well, I don't know how to express. You know how to express physical affection with another man, so it's something similar, where you're expressing affection in a physical sense by touching or hugging, which we do with men, or women do with women all the time. And how to do that? How do you do that with the opposite sex? Because you don't see them as a machine. As we said last week, Prabhupada said, don't see your wife as a machine for sense gratification. So you're not seeing them as a machine for sense gratification. So what Madhyavatar is saying, that so many men come to Krishna consciousness conditioned that that's the only way they relate to women, as machines for their enjoyment. So now he's explaining that this has been the result of a culture that we've been living in that is teaching us that the sexual desire, is normal and natural, as is food and air. And that means trying to repress it is artificial, unnatural. And they'll say, if you try to repress it, you'll become crazy. And I find that in today's world, when people, sometimes they'll even, they'll know what I'm doing, and they'll even say, you're not celibate, are you? Because they think that's kind of madness, or there's something like, you're like torturing yourself or something. Not only, so he's talking about the literature that has made people, compared sex desire to equivalent to the need for air and food. Not only have they presented the satisfaction of such an urge as inevitable, they have even declared that whoever neglects it would develop psychological disorders. Yeah, so this is like the epitome of their madness. One of the things that we find as devotees, and I think that the reason that this literature is out there is that people, they don't have transcendental experiences, but what we find as devotees is that, and Prabhupada has said this so many times, that as you advance in Krishna consciousness, your sexual desire decreases. So we're not just talking about subtle, we're talking about gross also. And someone might say, but if this argument is true, then the gross desire it's connected with the physical, and you can't overcome it. But what we see is that the physical is connected to the mental, and when you overcome it mentally, it subdues the physical, at least to some degree. And that's why people who are Krishna conscious can subdue their sexual desire, whereas before they were Krishna conscious, they may not have been able to do it. It's because of the mind. The mind is connected. Let's see if Marina's here, because she could help us. Marina, are you here? No. Where's Marina when we need her? So, but just like we were talking about last week, the secretion of hormones. So when there's fear, there's certain hormones, or when you need adrenaline, you secrete adrenaline. And we talked about when you fall in love, then hormones are secreted. So for a man, when a man is thinking about, has sexual thoughts, I don't know for a woman, because I'm not a woman, maybe it's the same thing, but it secretes hormones, or it can. So then there's sexual desire, which is generated from thoughts or from what they're seeing. So then, because our society is so rampant with these visuals that young boys grow up with, and then therefore are in their consciousness, in their minds, then it's taken to be normal. They say like, a boy has a sexual thought, teenage boy has a sexual thought every 19 seconds. So there's a joke where his father tells the son, they did a survey and they found that teenage boys have sexual thoughts every 19 seconds. And the boy said, well, what else am I supposed to think of for the other 18 seconds? So that's where society is today. So here, a funny story I may have told before. So this father, he walks through the living room or wherever the television is, and his son and his friend are watching a movie. And in the movie there's some sexual scene. So his father says, what are you watching? And the son says, well, don't worry, it's just there's not much of this. So the father, he makes some brownies for the kids. And he wants to teach them a lesson. And the mother's not there, and the mother would always make brownies when they watch television. So they thanks Dad, and they eat it, and they say, Dad, these brownies don't taste like Mom. There's something weird, something funny in them. Oh, he said, oh, that's just dog poop. I went out in the backyard and got some dog poop, but there's not a big thing because there's not much in it. So yeah, there's no problem, it's just a little sexual scene, and that makes this huge impression on a young boy's mind. What to speak of the fact that everywhere he goes, he sees girls who aren't dressed properly. So, okay, I agree that in a society that we live in, if you say sexual desire is equivalent physically with air and food, that's become that way because of the stimulus. But it's not naturally that way if you're in the right environment, if you're trained to see women respectfully and so forth. It won't naturally be that way. Sure, there'll be desire, it's a physical desire, but not aggravated to the extreme that it is now. So he's saying that now somebody becomes a devotee who's grown up that way, and then that's what we're dealing with. So, let's go back. Such literatures induce people to think of eroticism and sexual acts as something physiologically necessary, comparing sex to the need for food and air. Not only have they presented the satisfaction of such an urge as inevitable, they have even declared that whoever neglects it would develop psychological disorders. Hare Krishna. This is like the epitome of the paradox of material civilization. Because those who are celibate, they're so healthy and powerful. It is difficult to calculate the extent of harm such mentality has caused and is causing. It is truly a social and psychological plague, both on the collective and on the individual level. Spiritual affection on the plane of spiritualization, of spiritual affection and friendship, sexual intercourse becomes... This was translated from Italian, so I may have to retranslate the English. Spiritual affection on the plane of spiritualization, of spiritual affection and friendship. Let's say, when there is spiritual affection and friendship, sexual intercourse becomes needless, extraneous, and artificial. So he's saying, okay, now people, they don't have experience of spiritual relationships of serving. I serve you, you serve me. That's a relationship amongst men and amongst men and women. So because they don't have that experience, then everything is sexual. But when you have that experience, then you don't need gross sex to satisfy you. Of course, that means when you're on that plane all the time. But then he goes on to explain the reality. But as we know, people acquire perfection after doing long efforts. According to Shastras, a married couple that can transcend illicit sex is on the direct true path towards perfection. Until there are distractions, I think he means unless unless there are distractions. Spiritual realization is overcast and shadowed, or when there are distractions. Okay, until there are distractions, no. Until distractions come, everything's good until distractions come, spiritual realization is overcast and shadowed. Besides the authoritative Shastric statements in this regards, the results of scientific research made by American universities in 1968 demonstrate that numerous couples can live well without sexual intercourse, provided they cultivate their interest for elevated ethical values. First of all, as I said at the beginning of my answer, people should try hard to abstain from extraconjugal sex because this generates hellish conditions in the society. I'm going to go back a little bit to this research. What he's saying here is that when a person finds himself with that they come to Krishna consciousness, they understand the principle of celibacy, they get married with the goal of making it an ashram, a Krishna conscious marriage, which is not based on sex, and when they take initiation, they make a vow. When a person is finding difficulty doing that, it's because of this unnatural conditioning that we've experienced growing up in this society. And that a person, if they understand that, if they begin to understand how they've been conditioned, then they can work to, they can work to purify themselves of that conditioning. And they can try to develop a spiritual relationship which has at its core something much higher than the sexual relationship. And then he's citing this example, which I think it's a powerful example and very important for us. And he's talking about non-devotees. And even for non-devotees who cultivated higher values in life, the position of sex got degraded in not sex being degraded, but sexual pleasure got degraded in their life to something which was not so important. So that's the whole idea of Krishna consciousness. It's the same thing. And so, like sometimes Prabhupada says sex is abominable. He's not talking about illicit sex. He's talking about any sex. And we hear that and go, wow, that's heavy. Because in our culture, sex is romantic, it's not abominable. They write books about it, they make movies about it, they sing songs about it. It's glamorized everywhere. And then Prabhupada comes and says, oh, it's abominable. So what does that mean? That means from the spiritual perspective of transcendental bliss and pleasure, that's how they see it. Just like Jamunacharya says, I spit when I think of my past sexual activity. It disgusts me. So that's natural on the spiritual platform. So Matsya Avatar is saying if that's strongly cultivated, then that's where we'll come to that position. And even if ordinary people cultivate higher values, they'll come to that, a closer position. Maybe not perfectly, but they'll come to a point where it's not that important. And they realize there's so much more about a relationship with another person other than the physical. So, people should try hard to abstain from extraconjugal sex, because this generates hellish conditions in the society, in the family, in the couple, and in the relationship between parents and children. Such illicit connections, metaphorically speaking, create hell. They create great embarrassment and pain. They condemn children to experience distress and harmful life modes, and condemn the spouse to anguish and deep suffering. Illicit sex in family life is like giving methadone to a heroin addict. Methadone is better than heroin. It's like extramarital conjugal sex, okay. But better than methadone is to rise above the problem. There's a story that Prabhupada tells of a man, I believe he was a Brahmin actually, and he lived next to, I believe she was a prostitute. Yeah, she was. And he really wanted to see her. And he had this devoted wife. And this devoted wife knew what his desire was. But they had no money. He was just a poor Brahmin or a poor somebody. And I think he was a poor Brahmin. Somehow this desire came over him. He was obsessed. So his wife began going to the house of this woman and serving her. She'd just go there and start cleaning and washing things. And she'd go there every day. And so she asked, "What do you want?" He said, "My husband wants you." And the prostitute knew that the husband was a Brahmin. So she said, "Okay, come over on this night." So what she did was she cooked meat in a gold pot. Or a gold pot or some pot with precious metal. And she cooked all sattvic food in an iron pot. And then when the man came, she said, "You can enjoy with me, but first we will serve you dinner." And then she served him the dinner. And she said, "Here is meat cooked in a gold pot. And here is all sattvic food cooked in an iron pot. Which do you want?" He said, "I'm a Brahmin. I can only eat sattvic food." She said, "The meat in the gold pot is like me. And the sattvic food and cooked in the iron pot is like your wife. Why do you want to enjoy with me? This is tamagun. Your wife is, this is your chaste wife. This is sattvagun." And then he got the point and he left. Became sober. Or we say, cooked in gold, cooked in iron, You could say, she could cook two sattvic things in different pots, but she cooked meat and said, "No, I'm like the meat. The pot's nice, but I'm like the meat." It's interesting, how in Vedic culture, you see all these stories of prostitutes who are like very Krishna conscious. It's really interesting. We have another story of the prostitute in Bilba Mangala Thakur, and she preached to him, "Hey, you're such a fool, you're after my body, you're crazy. If you had that much bhakti for Krishna, just think what a great devotee you would be." And he became Krishna conscious. Such a nice point, there's so much dedication to sexual desire, so much energy. I want to enjoy this, I want to enjoy this. Yeah, if you put that energy into devotional service, just think, wow, how Krishna conscious you would be. And then there's this other story of the prostitute, and she was always thinking, "Oh Krishna, I'm so full, and look at this horrible occupation I'm in." And she went back to Godhead, because she was always thinking of Krishna. So the prostitutes in the Vedic society apparently ended up in that position socially for some reason, but it's not that they were degraded. It doesn't seem to be. Okay. So here he's talking about, he's making the point that sex outside of marriage it's just disruptive to children, to society. It's just hellish. It's a drug. So his whole point is that it works two ways. Number one, let's say the man wants to engage in sex and the wife doesn't. And so on one sense you're talking to the man and saying, your desire's out of hand, you should work on it, try to purify it, elevate it. And on the other hand, you're talking to the wife and saying, to the degree that he can't, you have to help him, because it wreaks havoc if he goes outside of the marriage for sex. It wreaks havoc in so many ways. Methadone creates addiction, but not as strong and devastating as the addiction created by heroin. Illicit sex in family life creates dependence, addiction, and identification with the body, besides being a great waste of energy. But there's no comparison with illicit sex outside of wedlock. So he's comparing the drugs. I'm not so familiar with the drugs. I've never taken them. But I guess methadone is heavy stuff compared to sex outside of marriage. When my students intend to get married, I ask them to get to know each other very well. They should thoroughly inquire about the other's choices and priorities in life. They should become deeply aware of their responsibility, the obligation and the burden they assume in getting married. Then I become the witness and I commit myself to help both of them to overcome all the difficulties and to face their responsibilities, which include economical, social, and emotional aspects. These are all comprised in the sphere of family responsibility and consequently of spiritual realization. As I told you many times, ultimately to solve these types of problems, the solution is to seriously adapt to Krishna conscious mentality. So he's he's saying what Prabhupada is always telling us, that there's really, so many things you can try to do to overcome desire and control yourself, but the real thing is, it's by Krishna consciousness that it works. I've experimented with this in trying to discipline my mind and my senses and overcome desires which are not in accord with Krishna consciousness. And being Krishna conscious always works. It always solves the problem. Certainly, regulating eating, regulating sleeping, and so forth. There's so many material things we can do, but the ultimate solution is Krishna consciousness. Obviously, given the magnitude and complexity of the theme, this answer will not satisfactorily exhaust the various topics touched, but it will merely serve as an orientation tool for deeper study and meditation. So here's some notes. That's the end of his talk or lecture. That's a lecture, which was translated. Traces in the memory that determine the conformation of the deep psyche of unconscious, and which are the origin of mental tendencies and automatisms. So these are footnotes. So I'm going to go and see if you have any questions now that we've ended this article. No questions on the chat. Is everybody awake, or did you fall asleep? Is this supposed to wake you up, not put you to sleep? Oh, now I accidentally got off of Mayapur TV. I have to go to Mayapur TV. Anyway, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask. I'll give you a moment to think. Thinking is good. Maybe all your questions are answered. Of course, every situation is different. So he's just speaking general here. He's speaking in general here about how you would deal with this situation. Okay, Ananda Krishna, no video. Okay, so it's all very good, very clear. And yeah, okay. So I guess you want me to talk more on this. End of last class, we were trying to give some perspective on the effects of sexual desire, gross sexual desire, even subtle sexual desire, which is described as pride, the need to impress the opposite sex, the need to be honored, appreciated, and how that is directly in conflict with the consciousness of pure devotional service, pure devotion, which is humility, which is detachment, which is freedom from the bodily concept. So, everywhere in Prabhupada's books, he makes the point that one has to become free from sexual desire. It's just, if you want to become Krishna conscious, you have to. But at the same time, it's not like every day of our life we wake up and we're thinking, I have to be free from sexual desire. What we're thinking is, I have to love Krishna. But at the same time, Prabhupada often makes the point, and I believe we talked about this as well, is that sexual desire is an indication, the degree of sexual desire is an indication of how Krishna conscious we are, or how Krishna conscious we're becoming. Or in other words, that as you become Krishna conscious, that desire diminishes. As you become materially conscious, that desire increases. And so, often I've said, but sometimes we consider how strong the sexual desire is and how strong that pulling is, and we wonder, Krishna, why did you make it so strong? It doesn't seem fair. And it's like we're supposed to get out of the material world and go to you, and then you create this rope that's like we're so tied up in it we can't even get free of it. But looking at it from this perspective, the way Prabhupada's explaining it, you can say, one way of looking at it is it's like a built-in meter or a built-in indicator of how Krishna conscious you are or how Krishna conscious you're not. I mean, Prabhupada, he didn't say it in those words, but more or less that's how he said it. It's like so how do you know if you're Krishna conscious or not? Say, well, Prabhu, I'm very attached to the opposite sex, that's all I think about. I can't control my mind. All right. Doesn't sound like you're doing too well in devotional service. In some cases it may be that you just hit a certain age and it's a physiological thing and you're starting to worry if you're going to end up an old maid or something. And so that's understandable. But in normal conditions, then you have an indication, okay, something's wrong with my spiritual practice, my Krishna consciousness, I'm doing something wrong, because these strong attachments are there. So in that sense, if you say, Krishna, why did you do that? And Krishna says, that's why I did it. So you'll know, and it'll become this pulling that forces you to push forward, because if you don't push forward, you won't overcome this desire. So in that sense, it's good. Of course, we also discussed that if the desire weren't there, nobody would do it. But in the higher philosophical sense, I mean, Prabhupada says that also, if it's not, of course it's pleasurable, if it wasn't, no one would do it. But in the higher philosophical sense, and Prabhupada says that material pleasure, if you're trying to become Krishna conscious, then material pleasure, material happiness, the pleasure you get from anything material, becomes your enemy. The feeling of happiness you get from sense gratification becomes your enemy, because it keeps us attached to them. Anything that gives us pleasure keeps us attached because it feels good and we want to do it again. That's how it works. If nothing gives you pleasure, you're going to be pretty detached, right? Isn't it? I mean, if you don't eat things you don't like, I don't like beets. So if you give me beets, you'll see all the beets left on my plate. And I don't like them, I'm not going to eat them. My wife loves them. So she's not going to be detached from beets because she likes them. And I'm detached from beets because I don't like them. So anything that you like, you become attached to. Anything you don't like, you become detached from. You have a question? Okay. We have a question from the studio audience here. 1 second. So therefore, if there's something we're very attached to, and the attachment is, we're not dealing with it properly, then it's a sign that Krishna's giving us a little built-in barometer there that we need to do something. So it's not bad that there's attraction between the sexes. It's just bad if that attraction is not properly utilized. Whereas utilization means if you're a brahmachari, you don't use it. If you're vanaprastha, you're a sannyasi, you don't use it. And if you're a grihastha, you dovetail it. And in any case, whether you're brahmachari, grihastha, vanaprastha, sannyasi, the goal is to become free from it, because that's the binding force. So that's a very important point to understand. It's the binding, it's the central binding force, and we have to become free from it. And if you're not becoming free from it, then you have to do something to become free from it, whatever that is. And if it's getting worse, that's a sign of something wrong with your spiritual practice or where your mind's at, your heart's at. Something's wrong. Because as you become Krishna conscious, you become free from it. And now we have a question. Well, you can add to it. We have 2 questions. Here's a question. Sometimes I've heard that the more Krishna conscious we become, the harder Maya pushes. And the more these desires, along with other junk, will come up. The creeper and the weeds grow. Yeah, up to a certain point. I wouldn't say the more you become Krishna conscious. Maybe the longer you've been in Krishna consciousness, then, Prabhupada said, Krishna wants to test you, and ultimately any test is there to make you stronger. But if you actually become Krishna conscious, then it's not going to be harder, it's going to be easier. But yes, the junk will come up. But as long as you know the junk's coming up, and just let it come up and don't worry about it. It's when it comes up and you worry about it, that's when you're in trouble. Anyway, Maya will try to test you. Tests are always there at every moment. But if you expect that she's always going to test you as you advance, then, I don't know, I think you might end up in Maya, just expecting that Maya is going to come. Expect Krishna's mercy, that's a symptom of surrender. Always expect Krishna will protect you. And Prabhupada said, if we're preaching Krishna consciousness, Krishna will always protect us. So let's expect His protection. And I like to look at Maya's test in a different way. I like to look at, when I think Maya's testing me, I don't really think Maya's testing me, I just think I'm weak. And Maya's job is just to, I gave a lecture on this once, and I said, Maya's job is just to reciprocate with your desire. So if you see that Maya's strong, all that means is that your desire is strong, and she's just reciprocating it with it, because when your desire is not strong, she's got nothing to reciprocate with. So when I see that Maya is strong, I usually think, oh, that just means my desire for Maya is strong, therefore she's strong. So I don't always see it like a test. I mean, I just think the whole world's a test in general. It's always a test. Somebody says, I like you, that's a test. If it's going to go to your head or not, right? Somebody gives you $10,000, that's a test. What are you going to do with it, right? You're on the bus and you're sitting next, and the only seat free is, you're sitting down and some beautiful girl sits next to you because it's the only seat free. That's a test. Everything is a test. But if we're feeling that we're really being tested, it just means that Maya's coming to deliver what we want. And so if we're more Krishna conscious, then we don't have to worry so much about the test, because we don't want those things. Just like, if you're not hungry, then food is not a test. Controlling your appetite, desire is not a test. It's only a test when you're hungry. You're hungry, there's nothing to eat, you can't cook, you're on the road, what are you going to eat? You go in the store, whoa, what am I going to eat? Okay. Flu definitely gets rid of desire. Yeah, the flu's good. You have no energy in your body. You don't feel like anything. So, wow. We just lost Krishna.com. Amazing. No, we didn't. We lost Mayapur TV. I gave a lecture, Timothy, about this, and I can't remember what series it's on. Maybe Maya and the Three Modes, or some class I gave. It was very clear. It was very clear about it. Just as Krishna is reciprocating. The Prabhupada said Maya is strong because your desire to be Krishna conscious isn't strong. Or another way of saying that, Maya is strong because you want to enjoy Maya. So I think it's always a great way to see test, is just look at your own heart and say, okay, that's not really a test, it's just Maya reciprocating with what I want. It's like whatever we want to enjoy in this world, the Maya will make that attractive to us. So if we're becoming attracted to material things, it's ultimately because we want to enjoy them. Because you're not attracted to things that you don't want to enjoy. Okay, we have a question. I have a friend whose husband is not as renounced as her. They already have 3 children and she doesn't want any more. So she doesn't want sex. But he says that it's fine if they have more children because they are wealthy. Therefore it's fine to have sex. He is externally doing things to purify himself. Deity worship, donating, reading, chanting, reading Srimad Bhagavatam, but it's not having an effect. What else should he do? Come to Mayapur? Go on yatras, associate with advanced devotees? He has to, it doesn't sound like he wants to purify his desire. That's the problem. You have to want to purify yourself of the desire, then you'll know what to do. Once you, that's just how it works. So, I think any of these kinds of problems, I mean, I talked about this in another class, how if you're doing something or you have a desire and it's causing a problem for your spouse, then you want to think how you can do something to not cause your spouse trouble because of your desire. And then you have to get things in perspective. I think another thing I would look at is his lifestyle. I would guess, just off the top of my head, I don't know who he is, I would guess he lives a very passionate lifestyle. Because he's got 3 kids, which means he's at least in his 40s or 50s, right? He's in his late 30s, oh my God, he's really passionate. He doesn't mess around. So that's my guess, that he's pretty passionate and that he needs more sattva guna in his life. Because sexual desire is produced of passion, the mode of passion. So to conquer sexual desire, you need more activities of sattva guna. That's why Prabhupada said grihastas should do deity worship. It's more sattvic. So I would say, I would guess his life is very passionate, and I would guess that he's not going deeply into his chanting, and I would guess that as a result, he doesn't really have a strong desire to want to give up sex life. And ultimately, it's ultimately this desire to enjoy that's at the heart of the sexual desire. So if one becomes more Krishna conscious and purifies themselves of the desire to enjoy materially, that's going to affect the gross sexual desire, because that's where it comes from. Because that sexual desire is it's a form of imitating Krishna, which is why we have to give it up. It's the reflection of love, of pure love. It's like see, what we have to understand is that gross sexual desire, it's like as far as you can get away from prema as there is. It doesn't get much more distant than that. And that's why Krishna is with Radha and the gopis, because it's the exact opposite of that. So, someone has to understand that it's not just something you take lightly. You go, well, it's okay, we can have more kids and more sex, and you're not the enjoyer. You're supposed to give that up. He'll say, well, I'm still young, I can't give it up yet. But we have to understand that it's not something that we want to keep doing. It's something we're supposed to get over with, get it done with, and move on. And it doesn't sound like he understands that, or wants to at this point. I'm sure he'll have reasons that he'll say, I can't do it, I'm not ready, which is the whole point I'm making, is that, well, when you understand to philosophically deeply, it gets you ready to, with the desire to want to give it up. Excuse me. To, okay, how long do you want to go on imitating Krishna? Let's just kind of like say, enough's enough, and move on into what is the real purpose of life. At some point we have to stop putting our energy into sense gratification and just focus it on Krishna consciousness. That's what it's all about, right? So we have to make that determination that this is, I'm going to stop putting energy into anything other than my bhakti. And so if he comes to that stage, it'll not be difficult for him to give up sex. Okay, well, he would want to. He'll understand that this is just keeping me here, We came to the material world to enjoy sex. We're not going to get out unless we give up the desire. So, sooner we give it up, the better. That's what I would say. Not knowing him. And if you tell him I said that, he might get mad at me. So, you have another question? No? Okay. So, anyone else have any questions? Oh, I talked about that point in the workshops in Mexico and Texas. What I find, Prabhupada, he's spoken a lot about illicit sex and detachment all throughout his books. And my experience is the desire is so strong, you can't talk about it enough. It's just, you always have to remind yourself that, because when desire overcomes us, strong material desire, we forget, the purpose of life. We just think the purpose of life is to enjoy. And enjoyment is everything. So, if you read Prabhupada's books in this regard, they're very direct, they're very straightforward. That, minimize your attachment. The goal is to become completely detached from attraction to the opposite sex. Minimize it while you're here. It's an entanglement. It keeps you in the material world. That's why we came. All material attraction is embodied in the form of the opposite sex. So, as we said before, if one is not completely detached, then one works through the Grihastha ashram in a way that one becomes purified. And that's what we're trying to do in these courses, is understand what is a proper mentality. And you see that when you look at all the problems in Grihastha life, at the core of those problems is you'll see that one or both persons have forgotten that they're not controllers and enjoyers, and that they're servants. Because when both people are in that mood of servant, it's the perfect consciousness to work together. And if there are problems, that consciousness solves them. As I said last week, I was reading this Grihastha manual put out by the Chapati Temple, and they said, at least in India, the biggest problem in Grihastha life is the man thinks the wife is just his slave, and she just should do whatever he wants, and she's just stupid, basically. I mean, not exactly like that, but you get the idea. Just do what I say. You're not that smart, kind of thing. And it's disrespectful. It's not the mood of Krishna consciousness. So I've talked a million times about this, how we understand the philosophy of Krishna consciousness very clearly. We preach it very clearly. We interact with other devotees in a Krishna conscious way, but within other situations we don't. So then a man may be very Krishna conscious, he's very humble and like that, but then with his wife he's aggressive, he's loud, he gets angry, He's not as supportive as he could be. No, so it's a paradox there, that somehow or other we it's like everything we learn. It's like, this is how you jump. This is how you pull the parachute, and then you jump out of the plane and you forget everything you learned. You've pulled the parachute a million times, but you never did it when you were flying in the air. And now you're flying in the air and you go crazy and you forget what to do. So it's like you enter the Grihastha ashram, and then all this, the nice humility and service attitude, everything you learned as a brahmachari, sometimes it just slips by you, and it just, this is my wife, you're not that smart, just do what I say, everything will be fine. And that's not Krishna consciousness. That might be the culture in which you were raised, but that's not Krishna consciousness. So these things are very deeply rooted within us, and that's why Prabhupada talks about over and over and over again. And that's why it's so difficult to understand, because the Purusha Bhav, the enjoying mentality as the supreme male enjoyer, controller, it's so strong. It's like Prabhupada said, it's like trying to straighten a dog's tail. You can't do it. No matter how many times you try to straighten it, it's still crooked. So it's not easy to understand these things, and we have to hear them again and again and again and again, and not stop hearing them. When you become more Krishna conscious, then you're on the realized platform. Then you realize all these things. But because that desire to enjoy the opposite sex is so deeply rooted, we always have to hear. And Prabhupada's words are very sharp, very strong. A really nice point Prabhupada makes is that for a materialistic person, their motive in life is sexual. They work for the family, that's what keeps them going, that's their impetus, or the impetus to become well-known. And that's what gets them up every morning, keeps them working day after day after day. And Prabhupada said, but a devotee works even harder without that impetus. He's free, but his impetus is stronger to please Guru and Krishna. So that's even a stronger desire. So that's why it overcomes the sexual, because the desire to serve Krishna and the desire to love Krishna is much more intense than the sexual desire. It's just sexual desire seems intense because we're not neutralizing it with the stronger desire of loving Krishna. So Guru Nishta says, if possible, and if we have time, could you please also talk about the Facebook quote, don't confuse bad decision-making with destiny. Oh, that's a whole other topic. Well, you want to relate it to Grihastha life? How did I ever end up marrying this jerk? What bad karma must I have had? No, you made a bad decision. From that bad decision, now you're suffering bad karma. There's a book entitled How Not to Marry a Jerk. There's so many women who will regret the decision they made, and they realize that the guy they married was a jerk, and they realized he was a jerk. They just were enamored by him for a while. And so the point of that quote is, you make a bad decision, you think, oh, it's just my karma to have married this guy. No, you made a bad decision. Don't confuse bad decisions with your karma. If we say everything is destined, it's not true. There's always some free will. But when you make a decision, you create a destiny. It's like, if you say everything's destined, that means that it's destined because of what you did. And what you did was a free will choice, which then created a destiny. So then you'll say, no, but in my chart it says I was supposed to marry a jerk. All right, what can I say? Don't make any more bad decisions. So it's your karma to make a bad decision. Yeah, then it's like, really? Was it your karma to make a bad decision? Was it your destiny? I would say, to answer your next question, how do I differentiate if what I did was a bad decision or was planned, destiny's hand? If it's destiny's hand, it had nothing to do with your decision. It just happened. You know, some airplane flew into your house. That wasn't a decision that had anything, you know. You decided to buy that house, but that's a karmic thing. That the airplane's going to fly into the house that you decided. That's different than making a decision to marry some guy who turns out to be a unfaithful and a horrible person, and you knew it and you had enough time and you didn't have to make that choice, or you chose, you made decisions that had bad consequences that you didn't have to make. The plane flying into your house was not a decision that had direct consequences. You know, investing your money in a certain company that goes bankrupt, that's a decision. Did you make that as direct consequences? Oh, it's my karma to lose all my money. All right, maybe it was, and maybe that's why you made a bad decision. But in general, I would say it's not a good way to think, because then you'll continue to make bad decisions and you'll continually say, it's just my karma. You get the karma for making a bad decision. And now you're trying to say, no, it was my karma to make the bad decision. Because I was destined to suffer, so I had to make a bad decision to suffer. Well, Krishna can arrange for you to suffer without making a bad decision. You know, you get enough suffering from your body, other living entities, natural disasters. You know, you don't have to make bad decisions to suffer. They'll come. So that's why I say, you know, anyway, how can you know? You know, well, like I was destined to get rich on December 31st. So on December 30th, I made a really good decision. And it must have been my karma to make that decision because I was supposed to get rich on the 31st. Yeah, that could be true. But as general principle, you can't say that because you don't know. All you know is you make bad decisions, you get bad results. You make good decisions, you make good results. So make good decisions. And if it's your karma and you made the perfect decision, everything's lined up, you consulted authorities, this is the way it works, and then on that day the bridge collapsed and your car was driving over it. That's not a bad decision, that was just karma. That's different. If you're meant to suffer, then you'll make a bad decision, maybe. But you should always think you have independence to make the proper decision. So, if you're going to get married, make a good decision. And if you're already married, make good decisions about how to improve your marriage. You're finished? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to stop here because I have things to do that are undone. And we'll talk to you. We'll see you on Tuesday night. And we're going to be broadcasting classes here, but it's not your time. It's going to be like midnight for you. Here in Mayapur, I'm doing some classes. But they'll probably be recorded, so we're doing some things on the Holy Name. Okay, everyone?